I hate praising other writers, but with Christie Blatchford, I've got no choice, really. She's one of the best out there and manages to cut through the clutter and the nonsense with an admirable common sense. She's been covering the Shafia honour killing for the National Post and much else. OK, I've praised you. Now we can move on. How are you?
We can go on a bit.
How are you?
I'm good, thank you.
But I don't know how you remain good, because the stuff you have to cover, this trial, for example, and I was only reading your articles and hearing broadcasts, it must have been awful to listen to.
Well, first of all, I don't have to cover it. I choose to cover it.
Okay.
I'm essentially a self-assigning beat within the criminal court.
You had no option here, though, surely. It was the big one.
I don't know.
Yeah?
I mean, I wanted to cover it, so... And the second thing is, it's cathartic for me to write about it.
Okay.
So I spread my... whatever it is, onto the reader. So it's not as hard as people think. That said, particularly I find, because I live in Kingston Monday to Friday, and I live in Toronto on the weekends, so I'm often driving back to Kingston on the same road, the 401, that the Shafia family took, which ended in in the deaths of the 4 women. And I often think about them in their black Nissan, and I wonder if they had any sense of foreboding or whatever.
Do you think they did?
Well, the evidence is certainly replete that they were all afraid of something. Rona, the other wife, had told people, and we've heard from those people at trial, that she was afraid of her husband, afraid she would be sent back to Afghanistan, afraid to leave, afraid to stay. Each of the 3 teenage girls, we've heard from a dozen of their teachers, vice principals, social workers, shelter workers, etc. Each of them was afraid as well. They were afraid of, these people said, of their dad, of their big brother, who was also on trial. They felt constrained. They were under pressure from their mom and their father to wear the hijab. They didn't want to wear the hijab. They'd only been in Canada, remember, 2 years. They had adapted beautifully. They were learning and speaking French. They were already speaking English because of where they'd gone to school before. They wanted nothing more than the ordinary freedoms of the ordinary teenager. So I feel acutely for them,
What were the physical, facial reactions of the accused during all this?
I mean, it depends. Mama Bear, as I've come to think of her, the second wife, the mother of the children, has, at the most potentially emotional moments, asked to be excused from the courtroom, and that's perfectly legal, and the judge has allowed her to be excused. The father has several times cried, both when he was testifying in his own defense and in the prisoner's box. The mom has also cried, I should say appeared to cry, because, I'm not sure, but brought tissues to their faces. The brother, Hamed, is pretty impassive and inscrutable, actually. I think too much can be made of an accused. Demeanor's not everything.
Over the years, I've covered stories, and maybe you have too, where men have been taken out of the house for spanking a child, and not really even spanking them very hard, but someone has seen it and reported it. What amazes me is that I think well-meaning people, but didn't see the signs, didn't intervene, police, social workers, all along the line, people within the religious community, the local community, no one thought, we've got to do something now to stop a tragedy happening?
You're right. I remember covering the famous so-called spanking case in St. Thomas with a religious group 10 years ago probably. So yes, but these... and there's no question, the girls were screaming from the rooftops. Their teachers twice called child protection authorities in Quebec, one English, one French. I think that was a complicating factor because one hand didn't talk to the other. The social worker came in one instance, interviewed the kids, pronounced the allegations founded, to use their language, which means, as she said, that they were true. She thought there was abuse, there was coercion, there was some physical violence, but it was mostly coercion and the kind of living in a repressive, as a political prisoner, one of their uncles said. And yet they closed the file. I mean, these are questions not for this jury, but for Canadians later. Why did they close the file? They've never said. I think institutions are ill-equipped to handle families that are not traditional families. In other words, immigrant families, families of another culture, of another race. I think Canadians tend to be extraordinarily deferential to those things, culture, race. I think that happened here. I think they thought, well, you know, it's not what we want, but are we imposing our values? I mean, blah, makes you crazy.
It does, because I'm always a little reluctant to attack social workers. I wouldn't want that job in a million years.
Me either.
However, this idea, Tariq Fatah refers to the racism of lowered expectations.
Yep.
That somehow, oh, they will do that, won't they? And we shouldn't interfere.
Yep.
Canada is Canada. The wonderful thing is, whatever you are, whatever you want to be, you have to obey the law. They were not obeying the law. These kids were in danger.
That's true. And, I mean, without commenting on the central allegations, which are, of course, first-degree murder of 4 people here, I think there's no issue that the children were frightened, they felt oppressed, they lived an overly constrained life, and everyone knew it. Their teachers knew it, their school knew it, social workers knew it, and no one did anything to really help them, you know, because of these lowered expectations. I agree.
Were the family part of the wider Islamic community, the local Afghan community?
Well, Mr. Shafia is the only one who's testified so far, Mohammed Shafia, and he said that he's not overly religious. For instance, when one of the girls ran away and then agreed to be married in very briefly, really it was half a day, no one knew where the local imam was. You know, that may be in part because they were relatively new to Montreal. Yeah. But I think they were not a particularly devout family. I think what they were is a particularly repressive family. I think they brought their tribal culture with them when they left Afghanistan all over the world. They've lived many other places. They lived for a long time in the UAE and briefly in Australia. Also in Pakistan. So I just think they moved this little culture with them wherever they went. And but I don't think they were particularly religious.
Okay. Well, a bit more of that when we come back, and also another case you've been covering. So a brief commercial break. People have to buy everything, then we come back to you.
Perfect.
Good. Welcome back to Christie Blatchford, wonderful writer, reader in the National Post now, and she's been covering the Shafia trial, and one other, we're going to talk about another case in a few moments' time. It is very complex and layered when we talk about honour killings and Islam. And only a fool would say that all Muslims treat women in a horrible way. I've travelled the Middle East extensively. It's simply not true. Mm-hmm. And honour killings do exist in parts of the Sikh and Hindu community, but the heartlands are the Middle East, South Asia, North Africa, Afghanistan. You can't separate the two. Even if this family weren't religious, some of the culture of Islam seems to stay with the family.
It does. I think this was a particularly dysfunctional, perhaps even psychopathic family, right. And you can't generalize from them. But that said, and we've heard expert evidence at the trial about this, that Mr. Shafia, if it were true that he killed these girls and the others, he would have been regarded as a hero in some parts of his native land, Afghanistan. And that's certainly, I mean, geez, I've been to Afghanistan. Yeah. I've seen the women wearing the full blue burqas, filthy burqas, impoverished women working with Stone Age instruments in fields of stone. I mean, it's a terrible part of the world to be a female, and it's a wonderful part of the world to be a boy. And they brought, and that is maybe uniquely Afghan. I'm not sure, but they certainly lived in Canada in some ways as though they were still in Kabul.
We know that the Middle Eastern countries where women have the most rights, Syria, for example, which was hardly a wonderful place to be, but it was a relatively secular country under Assad, women dressed as they do in Canada. Yep. And also in an Islamic way, but they dressed as they wanted. Under the Shah in Iran, they did. In Egypt, until, 20 years ago they did. So it does seem with the rise of Islam, the freedoms of women diminish. And you've been, this other case it's very strange, of a girl had a fantasy about a rival being after her boyfriend and arranged for her to be murdered?
Yeah, I covered this trial. The murder took place on the first day of the new year in 2008. A 14-year-old girl named Shafia Rangel was lured out of her house by a boy named David Bagshaw, who she knew peripherally but not well. She'd befriended him once when they were in public school, I think. And he then stabbed her 6 times. And he did so, the judge later found, at the behest of another girl who had never even met Shafia herself, named Melissa Todorovic. And the judge described Todorovic as the puppet master and the boy as the puppet. And it was a terrible story because it was all in their head. They tried to make each other jealous. It was all about social media. They texted each other hundreds of times a day, talked on the phone, Facebook, MSN, the whole thing. That was much of the evidence. And, you know, she lied about being interested in other boys to make him jealous, and he did the same with her. And I suspect he lied about Stephanie Rangel in part. And she developed this huge loathing of this girl she'd never met. Beautiful kid that Stephanie was. And she was, you know, dominant, assertive, tough personality from a very conventional background, no previous trouble with police, no signs of antisocial behavior, supportive parents, adoring baby brother. And yet she did this. And now she's in a youth prison in Brampton. And she's going to be 20 in a month or next month. And she wants to be, instead of being transferred as you are automatically at the age of 20 to an adult facility, she wants to serve out the remainder of her sentence, or at least until the Ontario Court of Appeal has dealt with her various appeals in this youth center.
I bet she does.
Yeah, I bet she does too. And she claims, you know, the people at the youth center say, well, you know, she's praising her for being assertive and vocal. Well, this is a girl who, when her boyfriend was stalling about killing Stephanie Rangel, and said, well, gee, I don't have a mask. This is in a text message, I think. She wrote, cut effing leotards. In other words, get your ass in gear and get that killing done. So I have a little bit of trouble seeing that she changed at all. She's a wonderful inmate. She was a wonderful conventional student before. Yeah. And look what she did.
So at this youth facility, they say she's assertive and confident. That's a good thing. When they were at least the perversion of those qualities led her to become a murderer, effectively.
Yeah, it wasn't lack of assertiveness that was ever her problem, but rather a striking lack of empathy.
How can they be so naive? Is that what they're being?
Well, I don't know that we have the full picture. The hearing takes place tomorrow morning. I believe that there will probably be other evidence from people at the youth center to suggest that it's not quite as clear. I mean, I'm not suggesting they're seeing her in a flawed way, but there are reports, you know, which, if you have a normal dysfunctional kid coming from a abusive, horrible background, which is most of the people who end up in jail, and they suddenly in prison become obedient, conventional, and eager to please, that is a sign of progress. But in this little chick's case, it's not.
How is it that we can name them? I assumed as...
Because they were sentenced as adults.
I see.
The sentencing as an adult doesn't mean you get an adult sentence. They got life in prison with, in Melissa Todorovich's case, 7 years of parole ineligibility, as compared to a sentence you or I would get, which is life in prison with no parole eligibility for 25 years.
Right.
So you should get a cut a break, and they are cut a break. But part of the sentencing them as an adult is the lifting of the automatic publication ban on their names. And there's good reason for that, too, in my view. I think we should know their names.
No, I agree with you. If she goes to an adult facility, would it be radically different?
It would be more crowded, probably less cushy. I believe she still would be able to continue her education. She has graduated from high school while in prison. She wants to go on to university. Good for her. I think that's great. But I don't think that is uniquely offered at the youth center.
Yeah. I'd like to say a pleasure. It's a pleasure seeing you. What you're saying is troubling, but it's always great to hear from you. Merry Christmas, by the way.
You too. Merry Christmas.
Thank you.